All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this afternoon's seminar. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Wei Peng from Penn State University, where she's a professor of both international affairs and engineering. She's also working very closely with the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy on integrated assessment modeling in China and India. So Wei, please take it away. We are going to hear your presentation. I'm going to abuse my privilege as the chair to ask one or two questions. Then after that, we'll open it for the audience. Please.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the introduction. It's a great honor of mine to be here. As Johanna just mentioned, I'm now at the Penn State University, but this is only the starting of my 4th month. So still a new professor transitioning in. I'm going to talk about China, sustainability, and energy, both brands. But before I do that, I want to take a step back and think about something big. What is it like to have high economic growth? To me, it means that every time I go back to my hometown, a city called Changsha in southern China, there are always new buildings, new roads, new convention centers, and new shopping malls. About 8 years ago, we got a new airport terminal for international travel. And about 5 years ago, we got a new train station for high-speed trains. And about 4 years ago, we got the first metro line running in the city. Now there are 1 more in operation and 4 more under construction. And Changsha is only a second-tier city in China. If we take a look at the larger city, like Shanghai, that was Shanghai in 1987, and Shanghai today. So you could see that this economic development in China has really been transformational. And that is the background for every story we tell about China, including the growing pains. Arguably, China is the world's worst polluter. It is the global top carbon emitter. It has very severe air pollution at home, causing 1.6 million premature deaths every year. And in the past decade, water pollution and water stress has become increasingly severe. So we can definitely see a lot of growing pains associated with the economic development. But what is behind this economic growth and environmental problems? Energy. And for China, mostly coal. In order to support this economic development in the past 3-4 decades, the energy consumption has been increasing rapidly in China. And coal, which is the darker brown line here, remains to be the dominant form of energy. We know that burning coal emits carbon emissions, and because coal also contains sulfur, nitrogen, and ashes, burning coal also emits air pollutants. On top of that, a lot of coal-related activities consumes water. For example, coal-fired power plants usually need water for cooling purpose unless they use more advanced technology that uses air. So the past is the past. How about we looking at the future? This is just like one projection from the U.S. Energy Information Agency. So you could see that for United States, which is the pink line down here, the electricity demand is projected to grow in the coming 4 decades, but not by too much. In comparison, if we look at China, which is the yellow line here, the electricity demand is projected to grow very rapidly. So what does it mean? It means that hundreds or even thousands of new power plants need to be built. But are we going to build more coal-fired power plants, which is dirtier, but still cheaper in China? Or are we going to build more solar and wind power plants, which are cleaner, but on a levelized cost basis, still more expensive? And this is really the motivation of my research. How can we really looking at not energy issue and environmental issue as 2 separate things? How can we really looking at the nexus of this energy environment issues? I also want to emphasize that climate change is a global concern. But in comparison, things like air pollution and water are largely local to regional concerns. Public opinion researchers have found that worries about global warming are less pressing than worries about clean air and water in your home cities. In other words, these local concerns carry much more weight than global concerns in shaping people's energy preferences and decisions today. So a good question to ask here is that how can we design the energy strategy in a way we can simultaneously address local and global sustainability challenges? I'm going to use two examples today to show how I, as an integrated assessment modeler, try to figure out a way to do that. So the first example I'm going to give is a demand side example focusing on electric cars in China. And then I want to give another example using supply side as an example, focusing on electricity generation and transmission. Any questions so far? Okay, let's get to the first example looking at electric cars. If you have been following the news, you probably know that China is really scaling up its electric cars development domestically. So you could see that starting from early 2011 or so, the electric car sales in China has been increasing rapidly, and comparing with the United States, China is definitely doing far better than here. On top of that, in 2017, the government also proposed a plan to develop a gradual phase out of vehicles that use fossil fuels. Until today, there was only one pilot program in Hainan province, but you could imagine that if the country really scales up this at the national level, this will be a game changer for the automobile industry, both domestically and also internationally. Remember that China has air pollution problem. It also has carbon emissions. So a good question to ask here is that what role can electric cars play? Given that we have two problems at hand, one is air pollution, the other is climate. So what we did is that we tried to use an integrated assessment methods to evaluate the air quality, the health, and also the CO2 implications if China uses more electric cars in 2030 time horizon. So how exactly we do this? Now I want to put on my engineering hat and go through the method a little bit. At the highest level, what we start with is a baseline energy and emissions projection. Basically, what if China continues to use gasoline-based electric cars? What will be the implications on the emissions and energy use by 2030? And then we assume that how about electric cars will grow rapidly in the coming decades? What if by 2030 there will be like 30% of two-axle car, basically passenger cars and lightweight trucks? What if 30% of them are going to be electric? What will be the implications on the emissions of both air pollutants and CO2? And then the next step is thinking about, okay, we have changes in emissions. What will be the associated changes in fine particulate matters in the air? So those fine particulate matter, they're so small, they can penetrate into your lung and pose health threat. And that is the reason why we focus on this. In order to make this linkage between air pollutant emissions and actual air pollution, we have been using a regional air pollution model called WRF-CHEM. I just want to show you why not just stop at emissions, why we need to use this like super computing intensive model to understand the concentration implications on concentration. Here is just like what I'm going to show you hourly PM2.5 concentration, just like for representative week in 2013. And I can tell you that the emissions didn't change much in that week, but see what will be the changes in PM2.5 concentration. That is what is showing here. The red means higher PM2.5 concentration. So this is the reason why we need to go for a really highly computer-intensive model in order to get this right. So you can see that even though emissions didn't change much during that period of time, the concentration really shows significant variations. There are a few reasons why this is the case. First of all, there is wind transport. So if you have emissions in Beijing, it can be transported into downwind regions. That's part of the story. The other part of the story is that the chemistry and physical reactions in the air are actually highly nonlinear. So we have to think about what is the relative humidity, what is the temperature level, and that will collectively determine the concentration of PM2.5. Okay, and after we get an idea of what will be the changes in air pollution level, we go for two more steps. First is that we use the annual mean concentration level to proxy for your exposure to air pollution. And then we want to assess what will be the changes in mortality, because epidemiologists have spent like a few decades trying to figure out if you expose to air pollution for a fairly long period of time, what will be the increase in your mortality rates due to cardiovascular diseases, having heart diseases, or lung cancer, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just like a one slide overview of our method. Any questions about this? Okay.
Can you explain the changes in human exposure? So
yeah,
how do they change?
So you have, in terms of how there are short acute exposure, there are also long-term exposure. And you can imagine that if we talk about acute impacts, you usually don't see people die next day because of air pollution. What we really want to focus on is what will be the implications on long-term. So we have to figure out, even if we have the hourly PM2.5 concentration, how to translate that into an average long-term exposure level. So what we did there is that we used the annual average as a proxy for the long-term average exposure level. But that is because, again, we want to focus on the health endpoint of mortality. If you want to see things like asthma attack, things like that, you probably would like to measure exposure using hourly PM2.5 concentration rather than annually. Any more questions? Okay, now I want to get to the results. So just quickly remind you, there are two things we care about. One thing is air pollution. So the metric I'm using here is air pollution related death. And the other thing we care about is climate change. So the metric we're using here is CO2 emission. So if we go for the current power mix, which is basically almost 60 to 70% coal, and at the national level, we do find reduction, which is the brown arrow down here. We do see reduction in air pollution related death, which is good. But we don't see much happening on the CO2 side. And why is this? The reason being that when we use more electric cars in our transportation sector, we can reduce gasoline consumption in the transportation sector, as well as the associated air pollution emissions and CO2 emissions. But at the same time, we have to increase the generation of electricity in order to charge those electric cars. Because in China, a lot of power plants already have hand-pipe controls for air pollution emissions. Even though we increase generation from coal-fired power plants, that doesn't really offset much of the reduction from reducing gasoline consumption in the transportation sector. But it's a different story for carbon emissions. So here, what we are observing here is that given that the coal power generation, the coal is really the dominant form of electric power source in China, this decrease in carbon emissions due to reduction in gasoline consumption is almost offset completely by the increase in carbon emissions to generate more coal-fired power plants. If we take a look at a more carbon-intensive grid in China, in Mongolia, it has higher than national average carbon intensity and coal intensity of its grid. We can actually see an increase in carbon emissions if that grid use more electric cars on the roads. And that is because here, the increase from the power sector more than offset than the decrease in the transportation sector. And this really motivates to think about cross-sector strategies. It is not good enough to just think about getting more cars to use electricity. We also need to think about, can we also simultaneously decarbonize the power sector? If China can do that, and here we're just like assuming not a deeply decarbonized power grid, but a power grid with only 50% of coal. If we can do that, we not only increase the benefits in terms of public health and air quality improvement, what is really significant here is that now we get significant net reduction in carbon emissions by having more electric cars on the road. So using this example, I really want to emphasize the importance of not looking at only demand side, but also focusing on the supply side, which will be my next example. But before I get that, question.
So is this because coal is more carbon intensive than gas?
Yeah, so China doesn't have much gas. So that's really the period. The end of story. If you look at the United States, the gas is definitely after 2011, you see a lot of like natural gas displacing coal power
I mean
plants.
gasoline. So
Oh,
this
gasoline.
is moving from sort of traditional cars to EVs, right?
Right.
So is this going up because you're moving from gasoline to like coal power?
More than that. It's more about if you are using electric cars in the transportation sector, what you need to change is not only within the transportation sector, right? You need to produce electricity in order to charge your electric cars. That means that you have to do something in your power sector. You have to generate more in order to charge the electric cars. So what I'm showing you here is that yes, the gasoline consumption in the transportation sector is reduced by having more electric cars. But because China, if we go for the current power mix, will use mainly coal power to power those electric cars, there will be an increase associated with that coal-fired power generation. So on top of the energy efficiency between gasoline and electricity, there is another level of story talking about there's a cross-sectoral implication that need to happen in order to have more electric cars. Does the answer? Yeah, I thought you were talking about natural gas, but now I get it. Mm-hmm. Any more questions for electric cars? Okay. I guess from the previous example, I hope you're convinced that we need to look at the supply side story as well. So there are some good stories. So arguably, China is the rising green giant. If you look at the investment in clean energy, solar, wind, etc., here's the China. Can definitely see the increasing trend in the past decade or so. And China is now the largest investor in solar and wind. But that's just like part of the story because the generation fleet in China is still dominated coal. And what is even worse, a lot of coal, kind of like new coal. So here, this figure is already a few years old, but the red part is the coal-fired power plants in China, and this is by age. So you could see that there are like two stories that in this figure. One is that China has a lot of coal, and on top of that, a lot of coal power plants are kind of like 0 to 5 years old. Given that the lifetime for coal power plants is roughly 40 years, this coal are going to be there for a very long time. So in order for China to really address the sustainability challenges, we have to ask the question about how to manage the coal fleet, in addition to what you probably have heard a lot about, the solar and wind story. So using this example, I talked about carbon in the electric cars example. Here, let's just focus on the other two local problems China is facing. One is air pollution and one is water. These two are local issues, so we have to understand where in the country these issues are important. These two figures here shows you the air pollution level and water stress level in China. The darker is the color, the more severe is the environmental stress. So you can see that the air pollution is really severe in the eastern and also southwest part of China. That is where a lot of economic activities are happening. That is also the area where population density is higher. But if you look at water stress level, it is broadly speaking the northern part of China that is under more severe water stress. So there is like supply story here. For example, the northwest is a very dry area, a lot of desert over there. And there is a demand story here as well, such as, for example, Beijing is here. This darker blue is also driven by a very high water demand in that area. But you could see that there's a geographic mismatch between where China have air pollution problem and where China have water stress issues. And that will have implications when you're thinking about cross-region infrastructure, such as transmission system. So you could imagine that there will be a difference between air pollution-oriented and water-oriented transmission system. If you want to really solve the air pollution issue, you probably want to transmit renewable power from the western part of China to the eastern part of China. But if you want to really use renewable generation as a way to tackle water stress, you probably want to use those renewables locally in this like northern water stress regions. And that is the question we want to examine here. How should we think about the transmission system design and how to manage the coal-fired power plant, given that China have two regional environmental problems that have different geographic patterns? So what we what we did for this project is that we used an integrated assessment so that we can design China's power system for air pollution as compared to water objectives. Again, just one slide version of how we did this. So we start with some scenarios for 2030. The reason being that there will be variations in terms of total demand levels. There will be variations on how much China can actually achieve renewable integration. So we want to design multiple scenarios to represent possible futures. But for the talk today, I will just use one example of many we examined in this paper. This is just one projection from the International Energy Agency. This is the World Energy Outlook New Policy Scenario back in 2017. From that scenario, it is still quite conservative in the sense that by 2030, they project non-coal generation only for 57%. The rest will be in coal. And then what we did is that let's design an optimization model so we can really see how the infrastructure are going to be designed in a different way when you have a higher priority to tackle air pollution as compared to water. The way we implement that is to optimize the 2030 coal-fired power plants and transmission relative to 2015, and we can make decisions on how much coal we want to generate, and also where coal power plants will be generated with the help of transmission, and also what kind of plant configurations we're going to use. Because if we use unapplied control technologies on power plants, then we can significantly reduce air pollution. If we can use dry cooling, which is basically using air to cool the power plant rather than using water, then that plant configuration can significantly reduce water consumption and restore. And then the objective here is to minimize the annual national total physical cost and environmental cost. The physical cost is just the normal terms, generation and transmission cost. But what is more interesting is the air pollution and the water cost. We monetize air pollution costs by multiplying the amount of emissions with an evaluation for air pollutant emissions. And we monetize water costs by multiplying the amount of water consumption with the valuation for water. There are different ways you can think about the valuation, but the way I would encourage you to think about in this setting is that if the Chinese government care more about air pollution control in the future or water conservation in the future, they will be willing to do more to tackle those issues, and that will translate into a higher willingness to pay for reducing air pollution and reducing water consumption. And that is what we want to capture by having a valuation. Independent of the true cost of those issues, the government priority higher government priority can translate into a higher implicit valuation for those two issues. So by using the optimization model I mentioned just now, what we have I want to show you air pollution versus water-oriented transmission. So if we go for the current valuation, basically these are the SO2 and NOx tax imposed on power plants in China today, and this is the current water price in China. If we go for this current valuation for air pollution and water issues, we don't see much transmission happening because transmission is expensive. You need to build a transmission line. You need to, even on a levelized cost basis, you have to pay some money. However, if we increase the priority on air pollution, here I'm just showing you one valuation that how about we increase the valuation for air pollution by 20 times. By doing that, we will see electricity transmission into the central China and the eastern China. This orange colors represent import and blue color represent export. So what is happening here is that because these two regions have higher population density, it is more valuable to reduce coal consumption and associated air pollution in this region compared with less polluted regions. So if the Chinese government care more about air pollution, they want to transmit the electricity into these population centers. But the pattern will be different when you increase your priority to tackle water stress. So if they care more about water stress, for example, increase the water price by 20 times, we don't see much thing happening. Because the area China has renewables is exactly the region where China has a water stress region. water stress issues. So now, if the Chinese government care more about water conservation, they just want to use the renewables locally in the northern water stress regions rather than exporting it to less water stress but perhaps higher population density areas. So here you can see that there's a clear difference between air pollution oriented and water oriented transmission system designs. And these are the considerations we believe the system operators need to consider when they think about what will be the future of grid for China. I'm almost done with my two examples, but any questions about this part?
What I mean is there a possibility that you develop your wind turbines around the north of China, which supply not only the local needs but also the needs and also transmit that power down south. In fact, south towards the south, you have So towards the south, you have this three gorgeous
Hydro is here.
hydro project
Yes,
there.
yes.
Now that could, if you have strong transmission lines, 1100 kV transmission lines between the north and south of China, then this hydro, and it's a big storage hydro there, so it could kind of help manage the intermittency
Yes.
of wind that
Yes.
comes from the north,
Yes.
and then it could serve your eastern coast.
Yes.
Uh,
I can talk about this forever, but when we're thinking about transmission system design, usually people talk about how can we design a grid system for better renewable integration. Because in China, wind and solar are abundant in northern China, and definitely right, hydro is abundant here, and the demand center, the load centers are generally here. So a lot of people are talking about, can we build a super grid so that we can have better storage for renewable integration purposes? The answer is definitely yes, but I guess what we are trying to figure out here in this specific analysis is that, hey, transmission is not only important for renewable integration and carbon, transmission also change the location of your generation activity, as a result, changing your water and air pollution impact. So I would argue that what we are doing here is more like a secondary impact once we have a transmission system design with considerations on renewable integration. What will be some local implications on air pollution and water? So we just want to emphasize that this is kind of like an understudied component comparing with renewable integration that has been really studied intensively for China and US and India, I guess.
No, see, the point from where I was coming was that as you showed us the air stressed part of China, air pollution stressed parts of China, and water stressed parts of China.
Right.
Now, from that perspective also, and as you are rightly showing in this graph here,
I guess you're asking why there's no hydro exporting to other regions.
well, what I'm saying is that you could still you would have an approach where you have sorry, if I could just
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
you could have your a lot of wind here,
Yes, yes.
wind here.
Hydro here.
Your hydro here, it already exists there.
Yeah.
So you take care of your air stressed areas, and as you were pointing out, that in this part, you need to have more of wind. Anyways, if you put a higher weight on air pollution,
Right.
right? If you care more about air pollution, so you still have your wind turbines here, but those wind turbines not only serve the local needs,
Yes.
but also serve the larger needs of China, along with
So that is already part of the results you're seeing here. But if you remember, in this case, only 57% is non-coal generation. So the share for solar and wind is not large enough to see what you're saying here. So in that scenario, that is like this scenario I'm showing you here is the new policy scenario from IEA. You can imagine that it's a still coal dominant. I wouldn't say dominant, but like still coal heavy scenario. So as a result, you don't see that much interaction from renewable side happen. However, that's the thing we haven't done yet. But if we use the same model, but testing, for example, 70% renewable integration, I would imagine that the mechanism you said just now, like how to couple wind and hydro and to address air pollution, will become more apparent.
and wind and both your water stress problem.
Yes, that's right. Okay, we should definitely talk more. I'm glad that we have a real power system modeler in the room. Okay, I'm done with my 2 examples, but if you remember this energy invention nexus that I always have in mind, till now I have only used my engineer hat and talk about how can we use the integrated assessment methods to analyze the synergies and trade-offs between multiple environmental objectives. But now I want to put on my policy research hat and really think about what, given that I've known all this after spending a lot of time doing the coding and data work, what should I tell the policymakers? So if you have been following the news, you probably know how severe air pollution has been in China. And since 2013, the Chinese government has declared war against air pollution, and that is really a game changer. Since 2013, there have been a lot of policies being implemented. A lot of air pollution control policies also target how can we reduce coal consumption, for example, and that will have like climate co-benefits associated with that. So as an engineer, we have spent a lot of time thinking about how should China co-control air pollution and CO2 emissions, given that the air pollution is already a government priority. And this is really a great policy window for China to lock in some of the climate-friendly actions as well. So we have found a lot of win-win solutions that is beneficial for both, such as reducing coal consumption, increasing renewables, improve energy efficiency, as well as some like new technology deployments, such as using coal and biomass together with CCS. We also find some strategy that is good for air quality, but not that good for carbon mitigation. For example, if we put more anopipe controls on power plants, that will reduce the plant efficiency by a few %. As a result, increase your carbon emissions by per electric output. But that's really a small penalty, I would say, comparing with the amount of air pollution reduction we can get. And we also find China has been doing converting coal to gas. We call that synthetic natural gas power plant. That's really a headache for carbon emissions. If we convert coal to gas, yes, gas is cleaner, so we reduce air pollution problem to a large extent. But by converting energy multiple times from coal to gas and then gas to something like electricity, you really decrease your overall efficiency and increase your life cycle carbon emissions. And that's definitely a bad thing for carbon. We also find things that's like case dependent, like the example on electric vehicles I just said. That is a case dependent scenario based on how decarbonized the power system is at the same time. Another example is electricity transmission corridors for air pollution control. China is building exactly transmission corridors under air pollution control purpose. And you can imagine that if you transmit coal power from the west to the east, you solve the eastern air pollution problem. You don't get much carbon mitigation benefits because you're burning coal anyway. But if you can use the transmission corridor to transmit renewables, that will be the situation where you get co-benefits for climate. So we have done a lot of calculation and estimation for all this strategy, but we have identified the some different characteristics. It seems to be straightforward. What should we tell the policymakers? So with those strategies that are win-win or have a lot of public health benefits with just tiny bit of carbon emissions, let's just do it. But for those strategies that have good air quality implications, but really bad for carbon emissions, let's try to avoid those developments. And finally, for those strategies that's a case dependent, let's be strategic and thinking about how can we really make it win-win. But I should also say that this is just like the most straightforward suggestion we can give to policymakers. But if we take a step back and think about the deeper challenge that the Chinese government is facing today, I would say that is how to bring this near-term and long-term issues, near-term being air pollution, long-term being the climate threat, and how to bridge this local and global concerns. In other words, a fundamental question the government should be thinking about today is that how much decarbonization can be achieved if we just rely on air pollution, water, or health incentives, all this near-term and local stuff. I would argue that there are reasons to worry Okay, so first of all, if we are really thinking about deep decarbonization, because that's what ultimately we need in order to achieve 2-degree goal, 1.5-degree goal, deep decarbonization will require fundamental changes in the energy system, but air pollution can be solved largely without that. And the United States is a very good example. We have very good end-of-life controls for vehicles, for power plants, and we can largely solve the air pollution problem without really tackling the real issues in the energy system. On top of that, the marginal cost to squeeze coal out of the economy will increase as low-cost options run out. About 10 years ago, China started to close down small coal-fired power plants. Small meaning lower than 15 megawatts. So those are really low-cost options to squeeze coal out of the economy. But today, that percent is down by only 10%, down to 10%. So even just looking at the power sector, we are already observing low-cost options running out. And then China needs to think about what will be the higher cost options in order to really further reduce coal in the energy system. The second reason to be worried, I would argue, is that as air gets cleaner, the urgency to curb air pollution will reduce. So that will leave smaller room to emphasize climate co-benefits over time. But I would also argue that there are reasons to be optimistic. If China can continue and accelerate its clean energy transition, continue to be this green giant, and if China can coordinate the policies for air pollution, water, climate, and energy. So you can see that there are a lot of things here, and I'd be happy to talk about this in Q&A. The governance structure is not there yet, but I think this is a common challenge no matter which country we're talking about, even here. Finally, there's a final caveat, because when we're thinking about the climate issue, it responds to cumulative global emissions. It doesn't really matter what China is doing domestically, it matters equally what China is doing internationally. So there will be linkages between China's domestic and international activities, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, and there will be linkages between the recipient country's local needs and China's Go Global strategy. I would highly encourage students in this program, and also in my home department at Penn State, to think more about these linkages. With that, I'll just end here and take questions.
Wonderful, thank you. I'll start with two questions.
Sure.
The first one is just on the assumptions, and this is going back to the study on transmission planning. Are you assuming in that study that you can kind of redesign the system from scratch, where plants can be moved freely, or do you assume some kind of inertia in the system?
Well, if you're talking political inertia, no. If you're talking about infrastructure today, yes. So what we did is that we want to design a 2030 scenario compared to 2015 with the consideration on what is already in place today. But we don't consider the inertia over time. So for example, if you have a power plants today and you already designed a transmission capacity for it, we assume the cost will be zero for that transmission. There will be some operational cost, but we don't assume additional capital costs to remove that transmission line.
So you're assuming that the things that are already there can be had for free? I mean, you could take them out, right? You could decide, okay,
exactly.
I don't like it, cut it. Okay, that's
yes.
Good. The second question is on the broader and long-term planning here. So what is your thinking if we assume that things go as they are, so China's coal use will probably not increase much, but it will probably also not decrease as fast as some people would like it.
Yeah.
How much time do we have? When do we need to start really shutting this down if we want to achieve, let's say,
yeah, you know what? I have mixed feelings, because there's a part of me worrying about global warming. My answer will be right now, today, next second. But there's another part of me who grew up in China and really see firsthand a lot of trade-offs that the government and also just ordinary people need to face between economic development and shutting down coal. So if you have been seeing what is happening last year in 2018, yes, the carbon emissions in China increased slightly in 2018, partly because the economy wasn't really doing well before. So a lot of things like really polluting industrial plants were operational last year. So this is not a good news for carbon mitigation for sure, but I also see the reason why it was the case. What I would argue is that try to embrace this air pollution crisis as a policy window for clean energy transition. Because this is really like the government is doing this, and like from the top level to provincial level, they're all like on the same page. Let's reduce air pollution and see if we can use this to reduce as much coal consumption as possible. But at the same time, if we could put end-of-life controls on power plants, I think that's still like giving coal power plants slightly more longer lifetime. I still think that's a reasonable thing to do. So I didn't really answer your question, but I really have mixed feelings.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
So why don't we get a few questions from the audience? Who wants to go first?
I was just wondering what role is there in China's energy policy for nuclear?
Yeah, I didn't really talk about nuclear much. So China is, I believe, almost the only country that is adding more nuclear power plants around the world. And it's definitely the largest installer for nuclear. So I think my impression is that China is not really betting on one single technology. They're not like saying that let's just bet on wind and solar, or let's just bet on nuclear. There's like no silver bullet, and they're really looking at these things as what we need as a portfolio in the future. So if you remember my slide showing the projected energy demand in China as compared to the United States, you probably see the reason why this is the case. Because in the United States, the electricity demand is kind of like stabilized already. So we're talking about what plants to retire and what kind of the marginal plant to add. Well, what will be the what kind of like share should natural gas plant operate as compared to like other power sources? It's a different story in China because everyone knows that we need to give more power plants. So there is some competition strategically between nuclear route as compared to renewable route, but in terms of actual investment, the competition is less in China compared to here. So I think the Chinese government is focusing on nuclear a lot these days. I also think that yes, nuclear safety and also waste is a concern, but I don't see the nuclear fear as much there compared with here. Nuclear fear meaning there's a disaster and things can go south. Any more questions? Mm-hmm.
Hi, I think China kind of gave a little bit of a surprise last year when joining the Global Wind Energy Capital.
Mm-hmm.
And just last week, the EDF announced that they were now signing up for a large couple of offshore wind projects off the coast of Beijing. Do you see any other parts of the energy network being opened up to other global partners?
Are you saying like other global investors investing offshore energy in China, offshore wind energy?
Well, other segments of the energy infrastructure in general. So
okay.
Invested in transmission or onshore wind or even nuclear.
Yeah, as I said, I really think China is like doing everything. I think I emphasize in my own analysis, I emphasize more onshore wind and solar just because they're like more mature. And if you look at offshore, it has been at the deployment and demonstration stage in the past 5 years or so. So I'm optimistic, I should say, and I think one benefit of having offshore is that offshore wind is that they're close to demand centers like Beijing and Jiangsu provinces. So I don't see any reason why China don't want to do that. I think they definitely want to do that as long as they can figure out the transmission thing and also the actually pricing thing. Pricing is really a big thing over there because the electricity price right now doesn't really, well, that's an exaggeration, but it doesn't 100% reflect the cost. Let me put it this way. And it's also not as flexible as the United States, where you really see how the generation costs translating to price signals in the consumer market. It's not the case in China. They really determine the price in advance, and there's like limited flexibility in terms of how to change the price. So I would say that the power sector reform is really important in order to realize the potential of things like offshore, because if you can have offshore wind when you have an electricity peak, if you have like real-time pricing, then that will be like more beneficial, economically more profitable for offshore wind. And that system is not there yet.
When it comes to the plan to promote electric cars, where are these cars made? Are they manufactured in China?
Yes.
And how does that like also work together with like an economic plan for the consumer economy?
Yeah, so I hope your professor Johann Snell is in the room because he's definitely an expert on electric cars. But you're right, most of the cars are manufactured in China, and like BYD is a big name in China, and there's definitely an important industrial policy component when China promotes all those things. It's not, I would like climate is what they would put in the document, but there's definitely a stronger incentive to strengthen the domestic manufacturing basis. In terms of consumer economy, I'm glad you asked this question because I think every time I go back to China, I feel that I'm like lag behind. Because like if you know the digital economy, like how like mobile payment, that kind of thing, like WeChat in China, I think that's really transformational. I think having if you don't know WeChat, WeChat is just a super app that is a combination of things like WhatsApp, what else, Venmo, YouTube, something like that, and Facebook. So it's like a super app. You can just like bring your WeChat, and you don't really need your wallet or your credit card. So I think that's to me that's the mobile payment and everything else on phones is really the new thing for the consumer economy. And then the implications of electric cars, I think is uncertain right now, because so many things are happening. But there are definitely a lot of subsidy programs, a lot of demand, a lot of if you get an electric car, you can get your plate, that kind of thing. But I haven't seen a large scale transformation as it is comparing to like mobile payment thing. But I hope that could happen. People think it's a cool thing to have, and all of them will get electric cars. I see you first, and then the lady.
So I came in a little bit late, so
Mhm.
you might have touched this issue, but about fracking in China, and what
I'm so glad Laura is in the room. I can talk about
the
it.
water scarcity issue, and
Yes.
Americans are very good at fracking now. What are the lessons that China can draw from regulations and U.S.
Yes.
technology or
Yes.
whatever?
Great question. And that's my friend Laura Singer. And Laura and I went to grad school together. And back in 2012, we went to China together looking at methane mitigation options for China. And one of the big consideration back then was looking at shale gas development. So we have been looking at that since then. The short answer is that the shale gas miracle here probably won't happen in China. Just like geologically, the shale formation in China is much deeper compared with here. So technically, it will be like much more costly. Even though I think people were kind of optimistic back then, but I don't see that shale gas boom really taking place in China. So fracking for China is a lesser concern. But if your question is more about natural gas in general, then I would say yes, natural gas is an important strategy for China today. They are talking about they're like LNG. LNG import is increasing over time, and they're also building infrastructure like gas pipeline with Russia and also Central Asia. So yes, natural gas is going to be a clean energy source for China in the future, but the tricky part is China just don't have that much conventional gas within the country, so they right now is prioritizing natural gas use in the residential sector and also industrial sector, not yet in the power sector that hopefully will be helpful for renewable integration.
So you brought up Professor Nam. I was in his energy and environmental governance class last year. One of the things we talked about is how local politics and political incentives really make sort of these big national plans, especially when we talk about transmission, really difficult. And I was wondering what kind of obstacles you've encountered in your research and how that affects sort of the results.
Yeah, right. I think that's always important. So if we look back the history for how wind capacity scaled up in China, there's definitely a local component of it. So I believe before 2011, small-scale wind power plants could be approved by local government. So there was a period of time when China installed a lot of like small-scale wind turbines without really thinking much about the transmission thing. So we worked on a paper a few years ago looking at why back in 2015, 14 or 15 or 14, why China had more installed capacity for wind, but less generation from those wind turbines compared with the United States. So that was really a big thing, and I would argue that not enough consideration for transmission at the local level is one of 4 to 5 reasons that explain that. On top of that, if you're talking about coal, I think the coal is most abundant in Shanxi and Shanxi, which is 2 provinces in north central part of China, and they're really experiencing a hard time. If you're looking at the employment data, things like that, they are having a lot of trouble these days, and that is why some of them are thinking about synthetic natural gas power plants so that they can continue use their coal resources, but not violating this overarching goal to reduce air pollution. So I think China is as large as the United States, but that's not really a federalism system. So, but you could imagine that those like tensions between states here will just be similar in China across different provinces. But the cool part is that sometimes the central government can really come in and try to negotiate. There is a transmission case between Yunnan and Guangdong that definitely have a central government role in order to make it happen. But overall, I think it would be better if we have an integrated policy framework. So we will know that what will be the role for provincial government, what will be the role for the central government, and specifically for each issues we're talking about here. Yeah, I'm not really answering your question, but really confirming with what Professor Nam has been saying. Yes, I think that's really a key thing to look at for China's political economy and energy space. Okay, I see both of you can go for it in a second.
Okay, sorry, I can't hear.
No worries.
So I have one question about your modeling work. So how does China's regulation influence your confidence for your modeling?
Yeah, good question.
How is it different from US?
Yeah. So we are not doing a very good job on that. The thing we are doing is that there are some components we tried to capture. We tried to capture the fact that in China there are 6 regional grids, just as interconnections here in the United States. So we definitely say that within each electricity grid there will be perfect transmission, but there will be a cost for transmission across different regions. That is consistent with the current power sector practices in China. But in addition to that, we didn't really consider much of the other politics, such as pricing, which is really the key thing. But I guess another component we kind of like tackled on is this priority to tackle air pollution issue, which is a policy consideration. But other than that, we haven't really done much in that analysis. That analysis is really to show that under what circumstances your infrastructure design should differ. So we are really, I just show like 20 times higher water price or air pollution price, but in the paper we definitely examine other price combinations. But the point we really want to make is that under what price combinations you will see transmission system designed in a different way. But happy to talk more because I have other projects that try to answer that question in a more sophisticated way, really modeling the political economy factor. Actually, with Johannes. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, so I just have one question. So while you're presenting like electric cars and like talking about how China is a green, like new green giant, I think of like energy storage immediately.
Yes.
So like yesterday, my organization, American Council on Renewable Energy, just like did a Hill briefing with like some folks from the energy storage associations, and they were talking about like even though like the current U.S. administrations have been like cutting funding for the EPA and renewable energy, but they're like still like subsidizing like the energy storage sector.
Yes.
So I was wondering like what's like the energy storage sector like in China?
I would say not much. The most common storage option China is investing today is still pumped hydro. But you could imagine that like water resources is abundant in the southern part of China, but wind and solar is abundant in northern part. There's an intrinsic transmission question associated with that. Part of the reason I believe China is underinvest in the storage capacity is again because of the pricing. Because now China has some policies to say that if this is a capacity providing ancillary services, basically to buffer this intermittency or the variation in this electricity supply system, if they're providing the ancillary services, the price they're receiving will be slightly higher than the other base load capacity. But that's pretty much it. So there's no really like in the United States where if you can use your storage capacity as a peak demand time, then you can get higher price, and this will give additional economic incentive for the investors. That is not there yet. So I really think that figuring out I honestly, personally, I don't think a complete deregulation could happen in China. My personal view. Other people may have different view. I don't think it's hard for China. It's hard for me to think about a system for China that pricing is really like real time. It's hard to do that. But I think at least from the government perspective, if they can think about some other ways to create subsidy or enough economic incentive to invest in storage, that would be a really important thing. Now they're really like, there's another story here is like which state-owned company is like stronger politically. Like China is definitely emphasizing a lot on transmission because we have a super grid company called State Grid Corporation of China. They're super powerful in China domestically in the political agenda. So that's why you probably have seen a lot of like ultra high voltage transmission coverage for China. But you probably haven't seen that much in storage because I haven't seen a very strong player in the storage space in China.
Thank you.
Like, are there other questions?
Please, do you have another question? We have time.
Yeah, we have time.
I have 3 questions.
Okay.
Yeah. Do I need a pen to write it down?
Go for it.
No, the first one is very easy. I mean, first one is that what is the percentage of by what percentage will demand in China be contributed by electric vehicles by 2030?
Yeah, that's a question mark. So what we did here is that we did different scenarios. We assumed 30% electrification. We also assumed 50%. I don't have that number on top of my head, but my impression would be like 10% increase, 5 to 10% increase in total electricity generation.
Because of electric vehicles?
Yeah, I think it's 5 to 10%. But don't quote me on that. I can dig up that number for you.
I mean, relative number, comparison with India is that by 2030, in India it's projected that if 100% electrification of electric vehicles were to happen, the demand on top of a business as usual scenario by 2030 would be an increase by 3% on the outside.
Yeah. Well, what kind of electric vehicles are being electrified? Are there like light trucks or are there like
isn't that all cars in India, all passenger cars in India, they were to go in front. So then this would be on the outside 30% increase by 2030. So
I am surprised. Why is that so small? Well, exactly. Oh, I guess the reason is the electric total cars number in China and India are different. Like the total amount of car in China today, I don't know the Indian number, but like in China is pretty large. So if we say 30% electrified is electrified, basically you multiply 30% based on a huge base.
Yeah.
And that number should be smaller in India.
They assume that the Indian economy will continue to grow at 7.5% right now.
Yeah.
And at that growth rate,
yeah.
I think we would have probably a lot of cars by 2030.
Yeah.
But then that is one.
Yeah.
I just wanted to have a comparison vis-a-vis India.
Yeah, I can look up the exact number for you.
Yeah. Second is that when we talk about, in the analysis, I got an impression by you answering the question that when you have used some goal programming for
goal programming
or multi-objective programming.
Yes, exactly.
For this, so
yes.
So when you give say equal weight to water concerns and air quality concerns, and what is the kind of grid configuration that you get?
You know what? We were not able to answer that question. I guess you're talking about like Pareto improvement or Pareto from. Yeah. No, that is not the way we're doing this. The way we're doing this is that we really focus on the exact numbers for valuation of water and valuation for air pollution. So given that you're familiar with the power system, you would know that the water consumption is very small from the coal power plant. So if you're really thinking about equal weights from the policy perspective, we need to have a very, very high water price in order to have the water issue as important as air pollution concerns. in shaping the power system decisions. So that is exactly the reason why we didn't really use the Pareto frown in this paper. What we did is that let's go for the current valuation. Let's just like try to capture the physical meaning of that term, the objective function. But what if we increase by 5 times, increase by 20 times, so increase by certain combinations of both? Yes, I wasn't able to really thinking about what would equal weight mean for air pollution and water issue in this specific setting with some specific policy meaning, but I'd be happy to chat more. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, because politically, from thinking from that point of view,
Yeah.
you have pressure groups which are kind of
Right.
could be equally strong on both sides,
Yeah,
and they could want
yeah,
infrastructure setup which
Yeah.
addresses
yeah.
all these
So
concerns.
another challenge I had when we were working on this paper is that water withdrawal is much important concern than water consumption. For those of you who are now familiar with the power plants, so power plants when they use water for cooling, they take some water in, depending on what cooling technology you use. There is a system called once through. Basically, you take the water in and you basically cool your engine and you let the water out. So it's like once through. There's another system called wet cooling tower. Basically, you take the water in, you use it multiple times in your system and having your pumps beside, and then you let the water out. So what basically I'm saying here is that there's a water withdrawal part that is basically how much water you take from the river, but there's a water consumption part that is evaporation associated your cooling process. So what we are doing here is just focusing on the valuation we're doing here is just for the water consumption. Because that water, if it is evaporated by engine use, then it cannot be used by, for example, agricultural sector. That's why we monetize that component. But we impose water withdrawal constraints in order to say that the total withdrawal cannot be higher than the available water in that area. But when we were doing this project, it was really a question of if we want to really say water concern, there's a withdrawal part and there is a consumption part. How can we model it with some physical and policy meaning? And that's why we ended up doing this way, having the water consumption being monetized and having withdrawal as a constraint. But I'd be happy to explore future ways of kind of like think it more systematically, not modeling one as objective, one as constraint, but be combining in some way to get a better sense of that.
In fact, this naturally brings me to the third question.
Yeah.
And that is around, you talk about inter-regional linkages and the inter-regional energy system linkages, inter-regional air quality, water. Everything is kind of regionally linked.
Yes.
Now, and also on top of it, you just talked about some restrictions or something happening in power sector which is impacting agriculture.
Yes.
And similarly, I could just take the argument forward and kind of link China with the rest of the world.
Yes.
Now, if this were to be modeled in an integrated framework and using a top-down approach, could we consider some kind of a regional computable general equation, regional CG kind of a framework, where we kind of talk about these things and evaluate these things both from a top-down point of view, and then probably soft link this with a bottom-up approach.
Yes, I'm so glad you're saying it. Sorry, I'm like keep looking at Johannes because we have a proposal with a professor in Peking University exactly on this topic. So the professor we're collaborating with Peking University is like Han Chen Dai, and he works on CGE model for China, and there's an international trade component associated with that as well. So we are definitely talking. The proposal we wrote was looking at electric vehicles in China and India and do a comparison. But if we spend the time developing the model, coupling the CGE model with something I'm showing you here, then we can really answer a much larger scope of questions than just electric vehicles. So yeah, happy to collaborate.
Yeah. So we have done some work for the World Resources Institute on the CG model for India.
Wonderful. Maybe we should
we should
take a look
more.
at it.
In fact, develop the low carbon pathways for the Indian economy.
Wonderful.
Using CG.
good. Yeah, that's really. I look forward to learning more about that part. Yeah.
So any
more?
final questions? We have
Yeah.
still time for one. All right, excellent. Well, thank you very much for a
Thank
great
you.
presentation.
Thanks so much. That is my email address if you wanna if you have any follow-up questions.
All right, thanks a lot, everybody, for following the live stream. See you next time. Bye-bye.